I never thought I'd hear those words, not from her best friend, not in that context. But there they were, hanging in the air, impossibly real. Her voice was casual, almost too calm, but the words, those words, hit me like a thunderclap, reverberating in the pit of my stomach, drowning out everything else. "You didn't know?" her best friend asked, a surprised laugh slipping from her lips. I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard, but it was already too late. My world had shifted. It was the kind of moment that replays in your head 1,000 times after it happens, but you can never quite make sense of it. You can't hear it, no matter how hard you try. Her best friend didn't even notice the impact of what she'd said, her tone light, like it was a casual remark, an offhand comment. She smiled and sipped her drink, oblivious to the gravity of what she had just done. But I felt the weight of it. I felt it in the way my chest constricted, how my breath hitched for a split second, and how I suddenly couldn't focus on anything else. It wasn't supposed to be like this. There were things about her, about our relationship, that I thought I understood. Things we had both agreed upon, things we were building toward, things we had promised. But this? This was something else. This wasn't a part of the plan. I had always trusted her best friend, thought of her as a confidant, as someone who was just as much a part of our world as anyone else. But this slip of the tongue, this moment of unintentional revelation, had shattered something I hadn't even realized was fragile. She hadn't meant to say it. I was sure of that. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was out in the open now. I tried to play it cool, to keep the facade intact, but I could feel my heart racing. It was like the ground beneath me had shifted just slightly, and now I wasn't sure if I was standing on solid ground anymore. I could feel my mind spinning, trying to process what she had said, what it meant, and how I was supposed to act as if everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. Not anymore. Her best friend had let something slip, something I wasn't supposed to know, and it had changed everything. As the conversation continued around me, I felt myself retreating into silence. I couldn't focus on what they were saying. I couldn't keep up with the light-hearted chatter, the casual joking. My thoughts were swirling, racing, trying to catch up with the reality of what had just been exposed. I tried to glance at her from across the room, but I couldn't bring myself to look her in the eye just yet. I didn't know how to act, how to handle the sudden shift in everything I thought I knew. She hadn't heard the comment, hadn't been around for that moment of vulnerability, and part of me felt like I was betraying her by even thinking about it. But I couldn't stop myself. The more I tried to push the thoughts aside, the more they came rushing back. What had been going on behind my back? What had she been hiding? How much did I really know? And why, after all this time, was it only now that the truth was starting to unravel? Her best friend's laugh seemed so out of place now. The casual, happy tone seemed to mock me, reminding me that there were things I hadn't been let in on. Things I hadn't been prepared to hear, things that had been concealed, maybe for months, maybe even longer. I wanted to confront her, to ask her if she knew what had been said. But how could I? How could I ask a question I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer to? How could I open that door when I wasn't ready to face what might come through it? The truth had always felt like something distant, something I might have eventually stumbled upon. But now, with that one sentence, that single comment, it had been thrust into my face. There was no going back. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself, and let my mind settle on what I had just heard. It was hard to focus, hard to form a clear picture of what had been said, what I had learned. The words kept playing over and over in my head. It wasn't a major betrayal, not yet, but it was a crack in the foundation of everything. And once the cracks appeared, they were hard to ignore. I could feel her best friend's eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to face her. I wasn't ready to ask her to clarify, to hear more about what she had inadvertently revealed. And besides, if I asked her, I knew the conversation would change, the light-hearted atmosphere would vanish, and all the things we had been pretending wouldn't be so easy to dismiss. It was in that moment that I realized how little I actually knew. Not just about the situation, but about her too. About us. About everything we had been building toward. She had always been so open with me, so honest. But was it all just a facade? Had I been living in the comfort of a lie, while she hid parts of herself from me? My heart ached as I thought about everything we had shared. The late-night conversations, the promises we'd made, the dreams we'd built. Were they real? Or had I been blind to the things that were simmering beneath the surface? I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that I might have been so naive, but a part of me couldn't ignore the growing pit in my stomach. I had to know. I had to confront her. But how? How could I ask her about this, when it felt like the question itself was already an accusation. How could I open that door, knowing there was no guarantee of what would be on the other side? My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my thoughts. I looked at the screen, my heart racing as I saw her name. "Are you okay? You've been quiet." The question was innocent enough. But it felt like a weight on my shoulders, as if she could somehow sense the storm that had started brewing inside me. I took a deep breath and put the phone back in my pocket. I couldn't bring myself to answer yet. Not until I figured out what to do with the truth that had been thrust into my lap. Everything had changed. And now, I had to decide what to do with the pieces. I couldn't sit still any longer. The quiet hum of the room, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into the background as my mind raced. I had to know. I had to confront her about what her best friend had accidentally spilled, about whatever had been hidden beneath the surface of our relationship for who knows how long. The idea of walking up to her, asking her the questions that were clawing at my throat, felt unbearable. The last thing I wanted was to ruin what we had. But now that the truth had been dragged into the open, I couldn't pretend I didn't hear it. I couldn't know it. And that realization stung deeper than anything I could have expected. As the evening wore on, the conversation in the room became a low buzz, and I found myself retreating more and more into myself. Every few minutes, my phone buzzed again with her name, a reminder that she was reaching out, that she was still there, trying to hold on to the connection we had. But every time I looked at her message, the weight of that comment, the one I had overheard, loomed larger. I hadn't answered her, not yet. I couldn't bring myself to. How could I answer when I wasn't even sure of the question? At some point, I found myself stepping away from the group, retreating into the quiet of the hallway. The bathroom light flickered overhead as I stood there, leaning against the cool wall, my heart racing. What had she been hiding? It wasn't just the words her best friend had said, though that had been the catalyst. It was the way her voice sounded when she spoke to me, the way she would sometimes look at me like she wasn't really seeing me. There had always been a certain distance in the way she would share parts of her past, like there were things she had locked away, things she was afraid to let me see. But this? This was different. This felt like a crack in a dam, a single moment that had forced everything I didn't know into view. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. She had found me. Of course, she had. She knew me too well to think I would just vanish without a trace. But as I turned, the look on her face was unreadable. Her brow furrowed in concern, and there was a slight tremble in her hand as she reached out, gently touching my arm. "I'm sorry I haven't been myself tonight," she said, her voice so soft it made my chest ache. I don't know how to make it better." I swallowed, trying to steady my breath. I had to do this. I had to ask her, but I wasn't sure I was prepared for what would come next. "You don't have to apologize for anything," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "But I need to ask you something. About what your friend said. About what I overheard." Her eyes widened slightly, and her hand fell away from my arm. It was subtle, but it was enough for me to notice. The shift in her posture, the way she braced herself for something, told me everything I needed to know. "You heard that?" she asked, her voice tight, as if the very question pained her. I nodded, watching her closely. I don't know how I couldn't. It was obvious. And it changes things. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, her shoulders sagging. "I didn't mean for you to find out like that." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and awkward, and I could feel the tension building. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her it wasn't the end of everything, but I wasn't sure how much we could save if we didn't address it. I didn't know how to unhear what I had just learned. What did she mean? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What was she talking about? Who was the someone she mentioned? Her face went pale, her gaze dropping to the floor, avoiding mine. The silence stretched on, and I could see the walls she had put up around herself grow thicker. It was like she had retreated behind them, and I wasn't sure how to break through. "I should have told you," she began, her voice shaking now. "But I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want you to think I was still holding on to him." Him. The word hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the fact that she had been with someone else before me. It was the way she had said it, like there was an attachment, a history that she hadn't fully let go of. The pieces of her past, of the person she used to be, were now starting to shift into place, and I didn't know how to handle the sudden flood of information. "He's someone from before," she continued, her voice distant. "Someone I was with a long time ago. But I never really closed that door, not completely. And when I met you, I thought I could let him go. I thought I could move on. But I guess I didn't realize how much of him I was still holding on to. I didn't realize how much it was affecting us. I didn't know how to process the words. She had loved him. She had let him into her life, into her heart, and now, all of that was still with her, lingering in the spaces between us. How could I compete with something that had been part of her for so long? How could I face the fact that the relationship I thought was real was, in some ways, still a shadow of her past? I'm not asking you to let go of him, I said quietly, though it hurt to say it. But I need to know where I stand. With you. With us. Because right now, it feels like I'm just here, trying to make something work while you're still holding on to someone who isn't here anymore. She was silent for a long time. The weight of the words hung between us like an open wound, and I could see how hard it was for her to say what she needed to say. I don't know if I can ever fully let go of him, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. But I know that what we have is real. What I feel for you is real. And I need to figure out how to make that work. I don't want to lose you. I wanted to tell her that I was willing to wait, that I could understand the complexity of her emotions, but the truth was, I wasn't sure I could. I wasn't sure I could keep pretending that everything was fine when there was so much left unsaid. I need time, she said finally, her eyes lifting to meet mine. I need time to figure out what's next. For both of us. I nodded slowly, not sure what else to say. She wasn't asking for a break, but it felt like we were standing at the edge of something we couldn't turn back from. The question remained, could we survive the shadow of her past? Could we move forward, despite the things that still lingered between us? And as we stood there, with the world around us continuing without a pause, I knew one thing for certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The days following our conversation were a blur of uncertainty. I didn't know what I expected from her, or from us, but I found myself waiting for the shift, the moment when we would both understand where we stood. But nothing happened as I had imagined. It wasn't a clean break, nor was it a clean fix. There were no dramatic gestures, no sweeping revelations. We just existed. We talked, but it felt like we were both treading water, afraid to dive deeper, afraid of what might come up to the surface if we did. She tried to be the person I wanted her to be, but it was like she was a shadow of herself. Her smiles were tight, her laughter strained. She would hold my hand, but there was a hesitation, a slight pause before her fingers would curl into mine. I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, afraid that one wrong move would send us crashing down. The space between us had grown wider, even when we were physically close. I had always believed in us, but now, I wasn't sure if that was enough. How could I continue if she wasn't fully with me? How could I build something when the foundation we had was cracking? She had asked for time, and I had given it to her. I didn't know how else to respond. What could I say when her heart seemed so divided? But every time we were together, I felt the distance grow, and I didn't know how much longer I could pretend that I was okay with being in the background of her life. I needed clarity. I needed answers. But asking her directly felt like it would break something that was already fragile. So instead, I kept my questions to myself, letting the silence between us grow. One night, a few weeks after our conversation, she came home later than usual. I hadn't expected her to be gone so long. I had gotten used to us sharing the evenings, even if we weren't saying much. But tonight was different. I had been lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The door opened quietly, and I heard her footsteps, muffled in the hallway. When she walked in, I noticed her face immediately. It wasn't just the exhaustion that lingered in her eyes, it was the way she wouldn't meet my gaze, the way she seemed almost closed off. She didn't say anything, but I could feel her presence, that subtle weight that had been missing before. "Hey," I said softly, sitting up in bed. I tried to smile, but I wasn't sure if it reached my eyes. "How was your day?" She paused for a moment, glancing at me before walking over to the closet, pulling out her pajamas. Her movements were automatic, like she was going through the motions of an evening she hadn't planned for. I waited, hoping she would open up, but she remained quiet. The minutes stretched on, and I could feel the tension in the room thickening. "Are you okay?" I asked again, a little more insistently this time. "You've been distant lately." She stopped what she was doing and turned toward me, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't speak. The silence between us felt unbearable. "I'm not sure," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide, as if she was searching for the right words but couldn't find them. "I'm not sure of a lot of things." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to demand the answers I had been holding back, but another part of me was terrified of what might happen if I pushed her too hard. "You've been distant," I said gently, trying not to sound accusatory. "It feels like there's something you're not telling me." She closed her eyes, as though she was trying to block out everything I was saying. "I've been trying to figure out how to let go of the past," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "I thought I could move forward. I really did. But I've realized that it's harder than I thought. It's not just about him. It's about me. About who I am without him, and who I am with you." I sat there, stunned by her admission. There it was again, that weight, that shadow of someone who still seemed to haunt her. "I don't want you to keep holding on to someone who isn't in your life anymore," I said quietly. "I don't want to be a second choice. I need to know if you're really here with me, or if you're still tied to something that happened before." "I am here," she said quickly, but the words felt hollow. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. "I want to be here. But I don't know how to be. I don't know how to just erase everything that's happened. The truth is, I'm scared. Scared of losing you, scared of letting go of the person I used to be. Scared that if I move forward with you, I'll lose myself." I could feel the frustration building inside of me. It was as if she was reaching out, but always holding part of herself back, afraid to fully invest in what we had. "You don't have to lose yourself," I said, my voice steady but edged with frustration. "But you can't keep living in the past, either. I need you here. With me. Not with him." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I don't know how to make that happen. I don't know how to choose between my past and my future." The ache in my chest grew heavier, and I reached out, touching her hand gently. "I'm not asking you to forget your past," I said softly. "I'm asking you to choose me. Choose us." She squeezed my hand in response, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't want to hurt you," she whispered. "But I'm scared I'm going to. I'm scared I won't be able to choose." And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit to myself. I wasn't sure I could keep waiting, keep putting myself in a position where I was always second, where I was always the one trying to convince her to love me the way I loved her. "I can't be in limbo forever," I said, my voice firm. "I need to know that you're choosing me, that you're choosing us, or I can't keep doing this." She looked at me for a long time, and in her eyes, I saw the pain of everything we had been through, everything we hadn't said. But even in that moment, I didn't know if she was ready to make that choice. "I don't want to lose you," she said again, but it felt like a promise she couldn't make. "But I need time. I need time to figure out how to let go." I wanted to tell her that time wasn't something I had. That I couldn't keep waiting, holding on to something that was slipping through my fingers. But I didn't say it. Instead, I nodded slowly. "Take the time you need," I said, my voice almost a whisper. "But just know that I can't be here, caught in the middle, forever." She looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumped. "I know," she whispered. And as I watched her, sitting there, so close but still so far away, I wondered if we would ever get to the place where we could truly move forward. Or if the past would always hold us back, standing in the way of something we could never quite reach. The days that followed felt like the slow unraveling of something fragile, something that had once been whole. We tried to navigate our way through the days without fully acknowledging what had been said, what had been left hanging in the air. She needed time, and I gave it to her. But with each passing day, I felt that invisible wall between us grow higher. The more she retreated into herself, the more I questioned if I had made the right choice by waiting, by giving her space to figure it out. There were moments when things felt normal, when we could talk without the underlying tension, but those moments grew fewer and farther between. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful anymore, it was suffocating, each quiet moment reminding me of the things we hadn't faced. I wanted to believe that this was just a rough patch, that we could get past it, that we could rebuild. But the truth was, I didn't know how much longer I could live in this uncertain space, where every word felt like a negotiation, where every glance held more unspoken meaning than I was willing to confront. We hadn't had the talk again. I hadn't pushed her to tell me more. I hadn't confronted her about the things that still lingered in the shadows. I was waiting, too, but now, I wasn't sure what for. Every time I tried to ask, to get some clarity on what was happening between us, she would retreat, pulling back into that place where she wasn't ready to make the choice. And each time she did, I found myself asking the same question: what am I waiting for? It wasn't until one evening, when the weight of everything had become too much to ignore, that I found the courage to ask her one final time. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring absently out the window, her cup of tea untouched in front of her. Her face was weary, and the lines around her eyes seemed deeper, like the weight of everything we hadn't addressed had started to show. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to press her again, to bring everything to the surface, but I couldn't take it anymore. "Are you ready to talk?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. I stood in the doorway, not approaching her, not forcing her to look at me, but watching her. "Are you ready to make a decision?" She didn't turn to look at me right away, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug absently. It felt like she was stalling, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to find the right words. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever before she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," she said, her eyes still fixed on the window. "I don't know if I'm ready to let go of everything that's still holding me back." Her words stung, but I didn't let myself react. I had been expecting this, in some way. I had been bracing myself for the truth, for the moment when I would finally understand that she wasn't ready to move forward, that I wasn't the person she wanted to choose. "I can't keep waiting for you to choose," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. I need to know if you're here with me. Really here." She turned to face me then, her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something raw, something unguarded. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "But I don't know how to be the person I need to be for you. I don't know how to let go of the past and be fully present with you. I don't know if I'm ready to make that choice." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt the sharp sting of disappointment, of heartache, because I realized something in that moment: she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to give me all of her. And I couldn't keep asking for something she wasn't willing to give. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to put the pieces together in a way that made sense. "I can't live in the shadows of your past," I said softly. "I can't keep giving more of myself to someone who isn't sure of me." Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down, the weight of what I had said pressing on her chest. "I don't want to hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I feel like I'm losing myself in trying to be someone I'm not. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to lose who I am in the process." I felt the pain in her words, and for a moment, I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that we could work through it, that we could figure it out together. But I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that we were okay when we weren't. We were both caught between two worlds, the one we had built together and the one that was still tethered to her past. "I can't be a part of your past," I said quietly. "I can't keep standing in the background, waiting for you to choose me. I need to know you're here. With me. In the present." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and I knew she understood what I was saying. She had always understood. But understanding wasn't enough anymore. She needed to make a choice. And I needed to stop waiting for something that wasn't coming. "I don't want to lose you," she repeated, her voice full of emotion. "I love you, but I don't know how to give you what you need when I'm still trying to figure myself out." And in that moment, I realized something. As much as I wanted her, as much as I loved her, I couldn't keep holding on to something that was slipping away. I couldn't keep waiting for her to be ready. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for something that wasn't whole, something that wasn't certain. "I know," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "And I love you, too. But I need to let you go. I need to walk away, because I can't keep holding on to something that isn't real." The words felt like they were tearing me apart, but I couldn't deny them. She needed time, and I had given it to her, but I couldn't keep waiting, caught in limbo, forever. It wasn't fair to either of us. She stood there, silent, as the tears continued to fall, but I knew this was the only way. We couldn't keep living in the shadows of what wasn't there anymore. With one last glance at her, I turned and walked toward the door, knowing that this was the hardest decision I would ever have to make. But it was the only one left.